"Just sit, sister, trust me," the rancher said calmly, and in a moment she finally understood why. The young woman had never felt so out of place in her life. The city she had always known, with its ceaseless noise, blinking lights, and crowded streets, seemed like a distant memory now. In its place was a vast expanse of green fields, rolling hills, and a quiet so deep that it almost felt alive. She had arrived at the ranch earlier that morning, her heart still racing from the long drive down narrow country roads, and she could feel a mixture of excitement and anxiety building within her. She had come here to help a distant relative, a family member she barely knew, but the promise of escape from her routine city life had pulled her to the countryside with a force she couldn't ignore. The ranch itself was larger than she had imagined. Wide wooden fences stretched in every direction, enclosing pastures dotted with grazing animals. A few barns and sheds stood scattered across the property, their weathered wood giving the impression they had been there for decades, silently witnessing generations of hard work. Beyond the ranch, the hills rose gently, covered in wild grasses and clusters of trees. She felt a momentary pang of wonder, realizing how small she was compared to the world around her. The air smelled of fresh earth and hay, carrying with it a kind of peace she hadn't known she was missing. Despite the beauty, a sense of unease tugged at her chest. She had grown up in the city, where the hum of traffic and the glare of screens were normal. Here, she was alone with silence, with animals she barely understood, and tasks that seemed foreign and difficult. Her hands, accustomed to the soft keys of a laptop, now felt clumsy as she held the straps of her bag, uncertain what to do first. The ranch, though welcoming in appearance, felt like a world with its own rules, rules she did not yet know how to follow. It was at that moment that she first met the rancher. He emerged from one of the barns, his steps measured and calm. He was a man who had clearly spent a lifetime on this land, his skin weathered by the sun, and his eyes holding a quiet intelligence that seemed to see far more than he spoke. There was an ease to him, a patience that immediately contrasted with her own restless energy. He greeted her with a simple nod and a soft, "Good morning." There was no fanfare, no dramatic welcome, just a calm acknowledgement of her presence. She returned the greeting, her voice slightly trembling. The truth was, she didn't quite know what to say. She had imagined meeting someone in charge of the ranch, but not like this. A person who seemed both approachable and untouchable, grounded yet somehow untethered from the worries that constantly plagued her mind. She watched as he moved effortlessly through the open space, opening gates and checking on animals without haste. Every motion was deliberate, practiced, and somehow reassuring. Even as he worked, there was a serenity about him, a rhythm that made her feel slightly out of step with the world around her. Her thoughts drifted to why she was really here. She needed a break, yes, but she also needed something more, a sense of clarity perhaps, or the chance to reconnect with a version of herself she feared she had lost. The ranch, with its endless skies and the quiet hum of nature, seemed like the perfect place to find it. Yet, as she stood there, unsure of where to begin, she felt the weight of unfamiliarity pressing down. There were animals to feed, chores to do, and expectations she could not yet name. The fear of failing, of looking foolish, crept into her mind like an unwelcome visitor. The rancher noticed her hesitation. Without rushing her, he walked over, his presence steadying in a way that surprised her. "You'll find your rhythm here," he said gently. "Everything has its pace. Don't worry about rushing." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her pause. It was not just a suggestion. It felt like guidance rooted in experience. She nodded, unsure if she truly believed him, but thankful for the kindness in his tone. There was no pressure, no judgment, just an invitation to learn, to observe, and to become part of the world he had inhabited for so long. She began to walk with him toward the main barn, her steps tentative. Along the way, she noticed small details she had never seen before. The way sunlight filtered through the gaps in the wooden fences, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, the soft murmur of cows in the distance. Every sound and movement seemed amplified in the stillness of the ranch. It was overwhelming, but in a strange way, it was also comforting. Here, she was forced to slow down, to pay attention, to breathe. She realized she had been running through life so fast in the city that she had forgotten how to simply exist in a space. Inside the barn, the smells of hay, leather, and animals were strong but oddly grounding. The rancher moved among the stalls with practiced ease, checking feed and water, making small adjustments, and greeting the animals in a quiet, respectful voice. She watched him, fascinated by the way he communicated not with words alone, but with patience, observation, and gentle action. There was a connection here between humans and animals that she had never fully understood before. The rancher turned to her with a smile. "You'll get the hang of it," he said. "Step by step, start with observing, learn their ways before trying to change them." The straw was dusty and tangled, the floor uneven, and the animal she was supposed to tend seemed restless, sniffing at her presence with cautious curiosity. She felt clumsy, her hands fumbling with the tools, her mind racing with doubts. But each time she looked up, she saw the rancher patiently guiding her with small nods or a quiet comment. "Take your time. Don't force it." His calm confidence was contagious, and gradually she began to settle into the rhythm of the work. Hours passed, and she found herself surprisingly engaged. The physical labor, the connection with the animals, and the simplicity of tasks that demanded focus but not overthinking began to shift something inside her. Her worries about city life, about her failures and mistakes, began to fade, replaced by a quiet satisfaction in doing something tangible, something meaningful. She began to notice how the rancher moved, how he anticipated the needs of the animals, how he understood the landscape in a way that made everything seem connected. She realized that this place had its own logic, its own pace, and that she was slowly learning to move in harmony with it. By the time the sun began to dip behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, she felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't known in years. The stall was tidy, the animals content, and she had survived her first day without disaster. The rancher approached her, his expression calm but approving. "Not bad for a first day," he said. "You'll do fine here as long as you trust the process." His words echoed in her mind as she looked out over the fields, the wind brushing against her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope and belonging. That night, as she lay in the small guest room provided for her, she thought about the day's experiences. She realized that the ranch was more than just a place to escape. It was a teacher, guiding her through lessons in patience, observation, and quiet strength. The rancher, with his calm demeanor and steady confidence, was not just a mentor in work but in life itself. She understood that this journey would be challenging but also transformative, and deep down she felt ready to embrace whatever lessons awaited her. By the time sleep claimed her, she felt a sense of anticipation rather than fear. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new tasks, new challenges, and new opportunities to grow. But she also knew that she was not alone. The rancher's presence, steady and reassuring, had given her a foundation of trust and patience that she had never known she needed. And with that, she drifted into sleep, the quiet sounds of the ranch lulling her into a peaceful rest, ready to face the days ahead. The next morning, the young woman woke to the soft light of dawn spilling through the small window of her guest room. The air carried the crisp scent of early morning dew, mingled with the faint aroma of hay and earth. Outside, birds were beginning their songs, a chorus of life that filled the ranch with energy. She felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness, unsure of what the day would bring. She had survived her first day, but the ranch, she realized, had more challenges waiting for her. After a simple breakfast of eggs, fresh bread, and coffee, she met the rancher in the yard. He greeted her with the same calm smile that had reassured her yesterday. "Today," he said, "we'll meet someone who might teach you more than I could with words." He paused, glancing toward a far pasture, and she followed his gaze. There, standing slightly apart from the others, was a horse. But it was not just any horse. Its coat was dark and glossy, but its eyes betrayed a deep wariness, almost suspicion. The animal's muscles twitched, and it shifted nervously, as if ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. "This is Shadow," the rancher said softly. "He hasn't trusted humans much in his life. Some would say he's impossible. But I believe every creature has a chance if you know how to listen." She stared at the horse, feeling a pang of fear. The animal seemed so unpredictable, so alive with tension, that she wondered if she was truly ready. The rancher must have noticed the hesitation in her eyes because he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Just sit, sister, trust me," he said calmly. The words were simple, but they carried weight. She wasn't sure if she fully understood, but she nodded, willing to try. He led her to a quiet spot at the edge of the pasture, far enough to give Shadow space, yet close enough to be present. "Sit here," he instructed, pointing to a worn bench under the shade of a large oak tree. "Do not approach him too quickly. Do not try to force him. Just sit, breathe, and observe." She did as he said, sitting on the bench with her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding. Every instinct inside her wanted to run to the horse, to calm it, to show it that she meant no harm. But the rancher's calm voice reminded her to stop, to wait, to trust the process. Minutes passed, and at first, nothing seemed to happen. Shadow shifted nervously, stamped his hooves, and flicked his ears toward them. The young woman tried to steady her breathing, feeling foolish sitting so still, doing nothing. But slowly she began to notice subtle changes. The horse's movements grew less frantic. He tilted his head, sniffed the air, and even took a cautious step toward a patch of grass. The rancher watched closely but said nothing. She realized she was learning something without words: patience. Sometimes, she thought, the hardest part is to simply be still and allow things to happen in their own time. After what felt like an eternity, Shadow finally lowered his head, grazing the grass closer to the bench. The young woman held her breath, afraid that any sudden movement would startle him again. She could feel a connection forming, fragile and tentative, but real. The rancher finally spoke, softly, almost as if he didn't want to break the delicate moment. "See, trust isn't about rushing, it's about presence." She nodded slowly, understanding for the first time the depth of his words. The calmness she had seen in him yesterday was not just a personality trait, it was a skill, a way of communicating without noise or force. Over the next few days, she worked with Shadow under the rancher's watchful eye. Each morning, she would sit quietly in the pasture while he guided the horse closer to her. At first, she could barely hold her composure as the animal moved unpredictably, his hooves scraping the ground and his tail flicking in irritation. But the rancher never forced the interaction. He reminded her to observe, to be patient, and to trust both herself and the horse. Slowly, she began to see patterns: the way Shadow responded to calm voices, gentle movements, and steady breathing. It was a lesson not only in working with animals but in controlling her own thoughts and fears. One afternoon, a small miracle happened. Shadow approached her fully, lowering his head until she could reach out and touch him. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against his soft coat, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The horse remained still, accepting her presence, and she felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. It was not a grand victory, she realized, but a subtle one, earned through patience, trust, and quiet observation. She glanced at the rancher, who simply nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You see," he said softly. "Trust grows where patience is planted." She had spent so much time rushing, worrying, and forcing outcomes that she had forgotten the value of waiting, of watching, and of learning from what was already present. Shadow had become more than just a horse to her. He was a teacher, showing her that sometimes the gentlest touch, the quietest presence, and the willingness to wait were more powerful than action or control. Not every day went smoothly. There were moments when Shadow would spook at a sudden noise, kick, or rear back. There were times when she wanted to give up, feeling that the task was too difficult, too unpredictable. But the rancher's calm voice always reminded her to pause. "Trust the process," he would say. If you let fear drive your actions, you'll miss the lesson. Slowly, she learned to breathe through her anxiety, to observe rather than react, to find a stillness within herself that mirrored the patience she offered the horse. Beyond the lessons with Shadow, she began to notice the rhythm of life on the ranch. Chores had their own pace, feeding, cleaning, repairing fences, but there was a harmony to it, a natural order that was different from the chaotic rush of city life. She watched the rancher move through his day, never hurried, never stressed, yet accomplishing more than she could imagine. He treated every task, no matter how small, with attention and care. She realized that his calm demeanor was not laziness or indifference. It was mastery of the art of living deliberately, of moving with awareness rather than impulse. Evenings on the ranch were magical. The sun would sink behind the hills, casting long shadows across the pastures. Animals settled into their stalls, and the air cooled, carrying the scent of earth and grass. She would sit quietly, reflecting on the day, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. Conversations with the rancher were often brief but meaningful, his words always guiding, never demanding. He taught her to read the subtle signals of animals, to respect the land, and most importantly, to trust herself. She began to feel a quiet confidence growing inside her, like a seed taking root in fertile soil. By the end of the week, Shadow had changed noticeably. The horse who once shied away at the slightest movement now nuzzled her hand, stood patiently as she approached, and even followed her short distances in the pasture. And she, in turn, felt a transformation within herself. The fear and hesitation that had accompanied her arrival were slowly replaced by curiosity, patience, and a newfound respect for life's pace. She realized that this connection, fragile and delicate as it was, symbolized her own journey towards self-trust and calm resilience. One evening, as they watched the sun dip below the horizon together, the rancher finally spoke more openly. "Life like this horse can be wary and unpredictable," he said. "The key is not to force it. Sit still, breathe, observe, and trust. In time, what seems impossible will become possible." The young woman absorbed his words, understanding fully now why he had said on her very first day, "Just sit, sister, trust me." It was not only about the horse, it was about life itself, about learning to move through it with patience, humility, and quiet strength. As night fell and the stars began to twinkle above the open fields, she felt a sense of gratitude unlike anything she had experienced before. The ranch, the horse, and the calm, patient rancher had taught her more than she could have imagined. She knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but she now had a foundation built on trust and patience. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful action is inaction, sitting still, observing, and allowing life to unfold at its own pace. The young woman went to bed that night with a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. Shadow had become more than an animal she cared for. He had become a mirror, reflecting her own growth and potential. The rancher's wisdom echoed in her mind, guiding her toward a life that valued patience over haste, understanding over judgment, and trust over fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as it always did, but she was ready. And she knew that with trust and calm, she could face whatever came her way. The days passed quietly on the ranch, but the young woman noticed a change within herself. Each morning she woke with a sense of purpose she had never experienced in the city. The chores that had once seemed overwhelming, feeding the animals, cleaning stalls, checking fences, now felt like a rhythm she could follow. The quiet patience of the rancher, his deliberate movements, and his steady voice had started to seep into her own behavior. She was learning, slowly but surely, to match his pace, to notice the subtle cues of life around her, and to let go of the need to control every outcome. Shadow, the wary horse, continued to be both her challenge and her teacher. Every morning she would walk to the pasture, her heart racing in anticipation. Some days the horse would approach her eagerly, his dark eyes soft and trusting. On other days he would hesitate, shifting nervously and keeping his distance. Each interaction was different, unpredictable, and yet somehow deeply rewarding. She realized that her own emotions influenced the horse's behavior. On days when she felt anxious or rushed, Shadow mirrored her tension. On days when she approached with calm, steady confidence, he responded in kind. It was a lesson she had never expected to learn from an animal. Trust begins with oneself. The rancher encouraged her to keep a journal, not just of the horse's behavior, but of her own feelings and observations. Writing helps you understand what you see, he explained one morning as the sun rose over the hills. You'll notice patterns, not just in the animals, but in yourself. Life works the same way. Observation is everything. She followed his advice reluctantly at first, unsure what she would find in her own thoughts. But soon, the journal became a place of reflection. She recorded each small victory with Shadow, each moment of fear overcome, and each lesson she learned about patience, presence, and trust. The act of writing made her see how far she had come and how much more she could grow. One particularly warm afternoon, the young woman noticed a subtle shift in Shadow's behavior. He no longer flinched at her movements or flicked his ears nervously when she approached. Instead, he moved with curiosity, sniffing at her hand and watching her carefully. It was a small change, but it filled her with a deep sense of accomplishment. She remembered the early days when just sitting near him had felt impossible without fear, and she smiled at how far they had both come. The rancher watched silently from a distance, his presence a comforting anchor, and simply nodded in quiet approval. "You're learning," he said softly when she looked at him. "More than you realize." Shadow was teaching her that trust could be fragile, easily broken by sudden fear or impatience, but also resilient, capable of growing stronger with care and attention. The lessons were not easy, but they were invaluable. She also began to notice how the rancher applied these same principles to everything on the ranch. He did not rush the work, even when the task seemed urgent. He treated every animal with respect, speaking softly, moving slowly, and observing carefully. When the fence needed repair or the barn needed cleaning, he approached each task methodically, without frustration or haste. The young woman realized that the calm patience he displayed with Shadow was the same patience he used with every aspect of his life. It was a way of being, a philosophy that emphasized respect, observation, and thoughtful action over fear or impulsive effort. One morning, as they worked together to check the fences along the far edge of the pasture, she asked him a question that had been on her mind for days. "Why is it so hard to be patient?" she said, brushing sweat from her forehead. "Even when I try, I feel like I want to rush to make things happen faster." The rancher looked at her thoughtfully, leaning on his tool for a moment. "Patience isn't about stopping," he explained. "It's about understanding that everything has its own pace. For Shadow, for you, for life itself. When you fight the pace, you create tension. When you accept it, you find strength. Patience is the bridge between fear and trust." Here, success was measured by the quiet victories. The moment Shadow allowed her touch. The moment she finished a task carefully and completely. The moment she noticed the wind shifting and the clouds gathering overhead. Life, she realized, could be meaningful without constant hurry. And trust could grow only when given the time and space to do so. Over the next week, she and Shadow developed a routine that reflected this newfound understanding. She would sit quietly in the pasture, allowing the horse to approach at his own pace. Sometimes, she would simply watch him graze, feeling a sense of calm wash over her as she observed his movements. Other times, she would offer gentle touches, speaking softly, and feeling the connection strengthen with each passing moment. Shadow had become a mirror, reflecting not only her patience but also her growing confidence. With each interaction, she felt less like a visitor and more like someone who belonged in this space. The rancher continued to guide her, not with commands but with quiet encouragement. "Watch, listen, and learn," he would say, his voice calm but firm. "The answers are there if you pay attention. Shadow is teaching you what I could never explain in words. You just have to be willing to see it." She began to understand that the rancher's true gift was not just his skill with animals, but his ability to help others find their own strength. By trusting him and observing closely, she was learning lessons that would stay with her long after her time on the ranch ended. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the pasture, Shadow did something remarkable. He allowed her to lead him gently around the field, following her steps without fear. The young woman's heart swelled with pride, but she knew it was not her dominance over the horse that had achieved this. It was the trust they had built together, step by step, day by day. She glanced at the rancher, who simply watched with quiet satisfaction. No words were needed. The lesson had been learned. Trust, patience, and presence had transformed a wary, fearful horse into a willing companion, and in doing so, they had transformed her as well. By the end of the week, she had grown in ways she had never anticipated. She felt more grounded, more aware of her emotions, and more capable of facing challenges without panic or self-doubt. She had learned to listen not only to Shadow but to herself, recognizing her own fears and patiently guiding herself through them. She realized that the ranch was more than a place to work. It was a living classroom, offering lessons in empathy, patience, and the quiet strength that comes from understanding rather than forcing. The young woman also began to appreciate the subtle joys of ranch life. She watched the sunrise over the fields, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on her face. She listened to the gentle sounds of animals waking, the distant calls of birds, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She learned to find satisfaction in small accomplishments, like a neatly cleaned stall, a successfully mended fence, or a calm interaction with an animal. These moments, she realized, were the true rewards of life, simple, meaningful, and deeply grounding. One evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, she and the rancher sat together near the pasture, watching Shadow graze peacefully. She felt a sense of gratitude she could not put into words. The horse had taught her lessons she had never anticipated, but the rancher had guided her in a way that allowed her to discover them herself. He had shown her that patience, trust, and quiet presence were not just tools for working with animals. They were principles that could guide her through life itself. As night fell, the young woman reflected on the journey she had taken so far. She realized that she had changed profoundly in just a short time. The anxiety and self-doubt that had plagued her arrival were gradually giving way to confidence, calm, and a sense of belonging. She had learned that trust, whether with an animal or with herself, could not be forced. It had to be nurtured, carefully and patiently, with attention and respect. Shadow had been her teacher, but the rancher had been her guide, showing her the way without ever taking control. By the time she went to bed that night, she felt a quiet excitement for the days ahead. The ranch, the horse, and the calm, steady presence of the rancher had given her more than she could have imagined. She knew that the journey was far from over and that challenges would continue to arise. But she also knew that she now had the tools to face them, with patience, trust, and a steady heart. And with that thought, she closed her eyes, letting the peaceful sounds of the ranch lull her into a deep, restorative sleep. The young woman woke that morning to the familiar sounds of the ranch, the soft lowing of the cows, the rustle of leaves in the gentle wind, and the distant calls of birds greeting the dawn. She had grown accustomed to this rhythm, feeling more grounded than she ever had in the city. Yet, there was a tension in the air, subtle but unmistakable, that made her heart beat a little faster. Today, the rancher had told her, they would be taking Shadow to the far pasture, a larger area where the horse had not yet felt completely comfortable. She sensed that this would be a test, both for her and for Shadow, a chance to see if the trust they had built could withstand a greater challenge. As they approached the far pasture, Shadow's ears flicked nervously. The wide open space, though beautiful, seemed to overwhelm him at first. He shifted his weight, stamping his hooves, and glanced toward the distant tree line as if imagining unseen threats. The young woman felt a familiar pang of anxiety. She remembered her own fears from the city, the sense of being unprepared, of being too small for the challenges ahead. She glanced at the rancher who walked beside her with calm certainty and heard again the words that had guided her from the very beginning. "Just sit, sister, trust me." Slowly, deliberately, she sat on a large rock near the pasture's edge, folding her hands in her lap and keeping her movements minimal. The rancher positioned himself a short distance away, not too close, giving both her and the horse space. "Watch, listen, breathe," he instructed softly. "Everything has its own timing." She nodded, focusing on the rhythm of her own breath as much as on Shadow's cautious steps. At first, the horse moved unpredictably, trotting in short bursts, flicking his tail and shaking his head. He seemed ready to bolt at any moment. The young woman felt her pulse quicken, the old fear threatening to rise. But she remembered the lessons of the past weeks: to stay calm, to be patient, to trust both herself and the process. She reminded herself that Shadow could sense her emotions and that if she stayed composed, he would eventually mirror her calmness. So she stayed seated, steadying her breath and letting him explore the space at his own pace. Suddenly, a sound broke the morning's calm, a rustling in the trees at the edge of the pasture. Shadow froze, ears alert, muscles tense. He snorted, tossing his head, and backed away slightly. The young woman's heart leapt. Her instincts screamed at her to run forward, to grab him, to control the situation. But she remembered the rancher's voice, soft and unwavering. "Just sit, sister, trust me." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathed deeply, and let herself become still. Slowly she opened them, watching Shadow from a distance, willing herself to remain calm even as tension crackled in the air. Minutes passed, and the horse gradually relaxed. The rustling in the trees was only a small deer moving through the underbrush, harmless but enough to startle him. Shadow lowered his head, sniffed the grass, and inched closer to her again. The young woman felt a rush of relief and pride. She realized that this moment, small as it might seem to an outsider, was a turning point. The horse had faced fear and uncertainty, and through her calm presence he had found reassurance. She had learned in the most practical way that trust and patience were powerful forces, capable of transforming fear into cooperation. The rancher approached her slowly, his presence calm and steady. "See what happens when you remain composed," he said quietly. "Fear is contagious. Calmness is contagious too. Shadow trusts you not because you forced him, but because you stayed grounded." She nodded, understanding fully for the first time the depth of his teaching. It was not about control or dominance. It was about presence, patience, and unwavering trust in oneself and in the process. The day grew warmer, and they spent hours walking through the pasture, slowly building Shadow's confidence in the larger, unfamiliar space. At one point, Shadow shied at the sudden flapping of a tarp near a shed. The young woman felt her heart pound, but she stayed seated, watching and breathing, letting the rancher guide him with calm words and gentle gestures from a distance. Slowly the horse adjusted, approaching the tarp cautiously, sniffing it, and then moving past it without panic. The young woman felt a surge of admiration, not only for the horse but for the process itself, and for the lessons it had taught her about patience, presence, and trust. During breaks, the rancher spoke with her about life beyond the ranch. "Shadow is teaching you more than horse training," he said, settling on a log beside her. "He's showing you how to respond to challenges calmly. In life, you'll face unexpected events, fears, surprises, and setbacks. How you react matters more than the events themselves. Trust yourself, trust the process, and you will find the way forward." She listened intently, letting the wisdom sink in. It was a lesson she had not learned in the city, surrounded by deadlines, noise, and constant pressure. Here, amidst the wide fields and patient guidance of the rancher, it finally made sense. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, a sudden storm approached from the west. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, accompanied by strong gusts of wind that rattled the trees and sent shadows racing across the pasture. Shadow became tense, snorting and tossing his head. The young woman felt the old fear returning. The wind was unpredictable, the storm approaching fast, and the horse seemed ready to bolt at any moment. Her instincts urged her to act, to run, to control him, but she remembered the rancher's calm voice. She closed her eyes, took deep breaths, and focused on being still. She reminded herself that she was not alone. The rancher was near, guiding both her and the horse with quiet assurance. Minutes that felt like hours passed. The storm drew closer, and Shadow's tension remained high. Yet by staying composed, speaking softly, and allowing the horse to see her calm presence, she began to notice him relax ever so slightly. The rancher reinforced her approach with soft words from a distance, never rushing or pressuring. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Shadow began to lower his head, sniffing the grass and breathing steadily, following her lead rather than reacting to fear. In that moment, she truly understood what the rancher had meant. Trust was not passive. It required courage, patience, and presence. By the time the storm reached them, Shadow had calmed enough to move steadily beside her. The young woman felt a deep sense of accomplishment and relief. She realized that the storm, which could have been a source of panic and chaos, had instead become a lesson in courage, composure, and trust. She glanced at the rancher, who gave her a small nod, his eyes conveying quiet pride. "This is why I told you to trust me," he said. "Moments like these are the ones that teach the most. You stayed present, and you both grew because of it." She had faced fear, uncertainty, and unpredictability, and she had remained steady. It was not just a victory for the horse. It was a victory for her own patience, composure, and inner strength. That evening, as the rain fell softly on the roof of the barn, she sat quietly in her room, reflecting on the day's events. The storm had tested both her and Shadow, pushing them to the limits of patience and trust. Yet through it all, they had emerged stronger, more connected, and more confident. She realized that challenges were not obstacles to fear, but opportunities to practice trust, patience, and resilience. The lessons of the day would stay with her long after she left the ranch, guiding her through life in ways she had never anticipated. As night settled over the wide fields and the rain subsided into a gentle drizzle, the young woman felt a profound sense of peace. Shadow rested quietly in the barn, and the rancher moved calmly among the other animals, ensuring their safety and comfort. She understood now that true strength came from stillness, patience, and trust, not from force or control. And she knew, deep within her heart, that she had begun a transformation that would last a lifetime. The days on the ranch had grown comfortable, almost routine, but the young woman knew her time there was drawing to a close. She had arrived uncertain, fearful of the unknown, and hesitant in every action. Now, as she walked across the pastures, the sun warming her back and the soft sound of hooves on the grass accompanying her steps, she felt a deep sense of confidence and peace she had never known before. Shadow walked beside her calmly, his dark coat shining in the sunlight, a reflection of the bond they had built together. She realized with quiet amazement that she had changed. The city worries, the restless mind, the constant need to control, those things no longer ruled her. The rancher observed her from a distance, moving among the animals with his usual calm assurance. He had said little over the past few days, letting her practice, guiding her subtly, and allowing her to learn through experience rather than instruction. It was a teaching method she had come to deeply respect. She had realized that the greatest lessons were often the ones discovered quietly, through patience, observation, and small, consistent steps. And now, as she prepared to leave, she understood the full impact of his guidance. That morning, she tended to the animals with a sense of ease and purpose. The horses followed her calmly, responding to her presence with trust rather than fear. She cleaned the stalls efficiently but gently, noticing the details that mattered. The softness of the bedding, the cleanliness of the troughs, the way sunlight filtered through the barn windows. Even the simple act of feeding the animals had become meaningful. She realized that caring for others, whether humans or animals, required attention, patience, and respect. It was a lesson she would carry far beyond the ranch. As she walked with Shadow in the pasture one last time, she reflected on the journey they had shared. She remembered the first days when he had been wary, almost impossible to approach. She recalled the moments of fear, when the horse's sudden movements had made her doubt herself. She thought of the storm and how her calmness had helped Shadow find steadiness amidst chaos. Every memory was a reminder of the growth she had experienced, lessons in patience, trust, courage, and the quiet power of presence. She felt gratitude for Shadow, who had taught her without words, and for the rancher, whose guidance had shaped her understanding of life itself. The rancher approached her as she led Shadow toward the barn. He did not speak immediately, simply observing her as she handled the horse with confidence and care. When he finally did, his words were calm but meaningful. "You've done well," he said softly. "Not because the tasks were easy, but because you trusted yourself, trusted the process, and allowed patience to guide you. That is the real lesson here. You've learned something most people never do." She felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of pride, relief, and gratitude. She realized that this experience had given her tools she could use for the rest of her life. The young woman spent the afternoon tying up loose ends, helping with chores, and saying quiet goodbyes to the animals she had grown to love. Each goodbye carried a mixture of sadness and appreciation. She had come to the ranch seeking escape, but she was leaving with something far greater: self-confidence, resilience, and a deep understanding of trust. Shadow nuzzled her gently, as if acknowledging the bond they shared, and she felt a tear rise to her eye. The connection they had built was strong, but she knew that the lessons would stay with her long after she left the ranch. Before leaving, the rancher invited her to sit with him one last time under the oak tree at the edge of the pasture. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. He spoke softly, choosing his words carefully. "Life will not always be easy, and challenges will come when you least expect them. But you've learned something important here. Patience, observation, and calm presence can guide you through almost anything. Trust yourself, even when fear tells you not to. That is what makes a difference." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle within her heart. As they sat together in silence, she reflected on how much she had changed. She had arrived uncertain, anxious, and unsure of herself. She had learned to observe without rushing, to act without panic, and to trust without demanding results. Shadow had been her mirror, reflecting the calm she had cultivated, and the rancher had been her guide, showing her that patience and trust were more powerful than force or speed. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, realizing that the ranch had not just been a temporary refuge, it had been a place of transformation. When it was finally time to leave, she packed her things with a mixture of anticipation and melancholy. She hugged the rancher, feeling the quiet strength of his guidance, and thanked him for his patience, wisdom, and for trusting her enough to let her find her own path. "Remember," he said one last time, "trust yourself. Trust what you've learned. The world will be different if you carry this with you." She promised she would. She led Shadow to the gate, watching as he followed her calmly, a testament to the trust and bond they had built. As she opened the gate to leave, she turned for one last look at the ranch. The field stretched wide under the clear sky, the animals moved peacefully, and the rancher stood in the distance, his figure calm and steady. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that she was leaving stronger, wiser, and more confident than when she had arrived. She had faced challenges, embraced patience, and learned the value of trust. These were lessons she would carry forever. The drive back to the city felt different from the drive that had brought her here. The roads, the traffic, and the noise no longer felt overwhelming. She felt grounded, capable of facing the challenges of her everyday life with a new perspective. The lessons of the ranch were not about the animals or the land alone. They were about herself, about trust, patience, and the quiet strength she had discovered. She knew that when life became overwhelming, she could remember the calm she had cultivated on the ranch, the moments of stillness, and the bond with a horse that had taught her so much. That evening, as she settled back into her apartment, she reflected on the journey she had taken. She realized that the experience on the ranch had given her more than she could have imagined. She had learned to face fear with composure, to observe rather than react, and to trust herself in moments of uncertainty. Shadow had been her teacher, showing her that patience could transform fear into cooperation, and that trust could be built slowly, step by step. The rancher had been her guide, teaching her that calm presence and steady confidence could overcome even the most unpredictable challenges. As she drifted off to sleep that night, she felt a sense of completion and contentment. The lessons of the ranch had become a part of her, woven into her understanding of herself and the world. She knew that life would continue to present challenges, but she felt prepared. She had learned to sit quietly, to trust, and to move through life with patience and awareness. She had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength comes from stillness, observation, and trust. And she knew that these lessons would stay with her forever. In the weeks and months that followed, she applied what she had learned on the ranch to her everyday life. She approached her work with patience, her relationships with understanding, and her challenges with calm confidence. She found that the quiet lessons of the ranch, the bond with Shadow, and the guidance of the rancher had given her tools for life that no city experience could ever provide. She carried the memory of those wide fields, the soft sounds of animals, and the calm, steady presence of the rancher in her heart, knowing that she had been forever changed by this journey. The story of her time on the ranch became a memory she would revisit often. She thought of the first days when fear had seemed overwhelming and smiled at how far she had come. She remembered the storm, the moments of doubt, the small victories with Shadow, and the calm guidance of the rancher. Each memory was a reminder that growth often comes in quiet, patient steps, and that trust, once cultivated, could transform even the most challenging situations. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons learned, knowing that they had shaped her into a stronger, wiser, and more compassionate person. And in her heart, she knew that whenever life became overwhelming, she could remember those days on the ranch. She could remember the horse who had taught her trust, the rancher who had guided her patiently, and the peace she had discovered within herself. She had arrived uncertain, hesitant, and fearful, but she left confident, grounded, and transformed. The experience had given her more than she could ever have imagined, a gift of patience, trust, and quiet strength that would stay with her for the rest of her life.